my students and they eventually wake up, but I've never done it to my peers, so there you go. I'm glad you're awake. Okay, I'm a hydrologist, so I think mainly about water, but sometimes about food and energy and how it cuts across those kind of sectors as well. I don't really do much directly on scaling, but it's pretty important to what I do because I work from the kind of local scale to thinking about global problems as well. So it's kind of a barrier and a challenge that gets in the way all the time, although I don't really sit down and try to solve it explicitly. So I'm going to give you some kind of thoughts, examples, and think about some applications where the scaling part is important as well, thinking about water resources management and food security, especially in terms of food production and how water cuts across with that as well. So, okay, so we're familiar with this kind of picture. This is the hydrological cycle, mostly interested in the land part of that. This is from a science paper about 10 or 12 years ago, so not that old, but it's quite simple. You know, there's a lot of things going on there, but it's essentially a very simplified cartoon of what actually happens. And all the familiar stuff with the precipitation, the evaporation, the runoff, and so on. And some kind of other features of the landscape, such as the mountainous areas where the dominance of cold season processes, wetlands, lakes, and so on. Of course, we have all the humans in there as well, which makes it much more interesting and challenging to model, predict, understand the system as well. So, but you can also kind of update this as well. So this is a very recent paper, came out a few months ago, where the authors try to think about these kind of diagrams, because they're everywhere. We use them in teaching, we use them in schools, universities, all kinds of things. We use them to talk to stakeholders as well. So they went through and looked at about 200, 300 of these different diagrams and actually thought that they were essentially all wrong, misrepresentative, and basically too simple. And often didn't have a lot of the processes that are important, but also didn't have a lot of the human elements in there, and especially how those operate at different scales. So you could probably say this is a bit more realistic, okay? It's a bit more complicated. You wouldn't really want to model all this kind of detail, but you could also argue that you have to because of these kind of point scale almost, or very small scale features that are very, very important to how we actually understand and manage these kind of systems. The other aspect that they kind of thought was important that's not really in any of these previous diagrams are the uncertainties. So each of these is a store, basically how much water is in each of these kind of pools across the whole hydrological system, but often they are represented as a single number. But here they're actually saying, well, there's some uncertainty in those. And they actually kind of rank those, going from the deep ocean being the biggest store down to water in rivers and the biological system. And there's actually quite a lot of uncertainty, especially when it comes to the subsurface. So we don't really know too much about how much soil moisture there is, let alone how much it varies and across different scales, but also in things like permafrost in groundwater as well, basically the things that we really can't see very well. So the upshot is it's more complicated than we really depict it to be, and there's a lot of uncertainties as well, and a lot of kind of scale issues in terms of all these processes potentially interacting. So this kind of summarizes that in terms of the scale. So thinking about the temporal scale going from seconds across to millions of years, although the billions of years has somehow come down the bottom here, and then the spatial scale going from local to global. I guess we can't go bigger than global really. And thinking about the hydrological processes that are essentially really happening down at this scale, this scale here, and going up to the aggregation of those and the intersection with the kind of global patterns and drivers that are coming back down the other way. Okay, so we're interested in how these hydrological processes can scale up and intersect with these kind of drivers that are happening in the kind of the other direction. So a lot of these are happening at the very local scale. We can think about how to upscale them. We have local processes that are generating things like runoff, that's generating floods. We have soil moisture variations at the kind of mesoscale, which is really important for agriculture and food security. And then we can think about things that are happening at longer and larger timescales, kind of geomorphological changes, things like development of major river basins and so on. So a huge range of scales that are really important. Of course, for decision making, we're really thinking about stuff that's happening at the kind of year down to even days or weeks when we're thinking about decision making for agriculture. Okay, so a few examples of kind of these processes that are important. You could maybe consider evapotranspiration as maybe the key hydrological process in the sense that it links the water, energy and carbon cycles together. So we know quite a lot about the different processes that act at different scales. Okay, so we know down at the least scale we're really interested in photosynthesis, respiration, but as we upscale we introduce new processes. As we go up to the tree scale, then we have a bunch of leaves together, so we have to think about the arrangement, the structure of those leaves, and then how for example, radiation is propagated through the canopy and how that canopy interacts with the local meteorology as well. We also have to start thinking about the root system and access to water, access to nutrients and so on. And then upscaling to the forest stand as well. We're thinking now about potentially the same species but lots of trees. We're thinking about competition now for water and nutrients and light as well. And then up to the catchment scale. So this is kind of the previous speaker talking about this nicely arranged clumps of species. We often do that in modeling, at least with land cover types. We basically try to separate them out. Okay, and that's one way of thinking about it. So as we upscale, we can think about how to do this, but we have to think about all these additional processes that are coming into place. So although this conceptually looks like a nice kind of idea, when we actually put it together, whether we're modeling or we're deriving evapotranspiration from, say, satellite remote sensing, we end up with a huge range of uncertainties, not just because of the approaches, but also how we take data and understanding and we actually upscale it to our scale of interest. Soil moisture is another important variable. So I do a lot of my work thinking about soil moisture, not actually measuring it and getting my hands dirty, but actually thinking about modeling it and trying to understand some of the variability. And there are obvious connections between soil moisture and evapotranspiration as a limiting factor for evapotranspiration. Now, soil moisture is highly spatially variable and temporally variable, and there's a bunch of drivers that really give us this variability. So this kind of fuzzy picture here is a kind of a small scale catchment. This is soil moisture from a model that's resolving that variability, and it comes down to a bunch of different processes that are driving variability across different scales. So obviously we have topography that's giving us this characteristic wetter regions in the valley bottoms versus the upland areas. But within that we have soil texture and structure that's really differentiating the local scale wet and dry, as well as we get dry down after a storm as well, which is highly variable. The topography, land cover patterns as well is really driving this at kind of larger scales as we get up to the catchment watershed scale. And then we have the climate drivers, the meteorological forcings as well, that overlay on top of that to give us this kind of complex picture of soil moisture in the end. So we can think about how these all kind of interact. In general, the simple way of thinking about it, if we just take a catchment as a whole, lump it together, we can think about a filtering process. So thinking about what happens across timescales. We have our precipitation time series that gives us some filtered surface runoff, and then this comes down into a more filtered version of near surface soil moisture, so smoothing things out essentially, filtering the signal, then into deeper soil moisture and groundwater, and then potentially thinking about base flow, what's coming from the subsurface into the stream as well. So essentially a nice filtering process that we can characterize with simple relationships. We can think about models to do this as well. But of course it's not quite as simple as that, because these kind of filtering processes are happening across space as well as time. So just a couple of examples about how different processes are interacting. So surface water, groundwater interactions are pretty important in many areas, and often they are really separated. So groundwater hydrologists think about groundwater, surface water hydrologists such as myself think about surface water, and it's pretty difficult to try to think about putting them together, often because the data and the modeling is done at different time scales, it's done with different methods, and the data is quite different as well. But obviously there are places where they come together, and these are the kind of key regions that we're interested in. We'd like to know where we have recharge, where we have water going into the groundwater. We would like to know where we have discharge, where we are actually getting water resources from the groundwater that's happening at very preferred kind of spots and across very small scales. Here's another example of these kind of interactions that are occurring this time across space and time scales. So the land surface has a feedback on the atmosphere. It's not always the atmosphere driving the land surface in terms of precipitation, for example, but the land surface has a feedback on the atmosphere as well, in terms of maybe a dry soil or a wet soil having an impact on the stability of the atmosphere and affecting the precipitation that's happening later in the afternoon or the next day. So this is empirical work, just looking at different cases where you will get rain, and is it because you have wet soils? Is it because you have dry soils? Or is it because you have a spatial configuration of wet and dry soils? So you can actually see rain happening in all these different types of configurations. So the temporal scale, was it wet before? The spatial scale, is it wet around the region? Are all important aspects to think about. So coming back to our crummy diagram of these different scales. So again, we have our hydrological processes and our global patterns and drivers. Why is this all important? Well, the scale actually connects all these. So our aggregation and interaction of these processes gives us our global patterns and our impacts, but also those global drivers such as CO2 variations, changes in climate patterns are really driving the local scale processes and having the impacts at the local scale that we're really interested in. Another reason why it's important, a few examples here. So flooding, essentially a problem, a scale, a time problem often. So the diagram in the back here is looking at some recent floods in Malawi, so very, very localized, of course, but there are a bunch of processes that can dominate why these things happen. It can be the catchment process, the catchment process that can really dominate this in groundwater dominated streams, okay? So it doesn't really matter what happens with the rainfall on that particular day or before. It's all about the aggregation of the water through the groundwater system that can actually give a flood, but a very slowly evolving flood. Whereas other catchments can be really dominated by the meteorological forcing, so a very quick, rapid response where it doesn't matter too much about the catchment itself. It's basically how much water there is and how fast does it come that will give you the flooding. So here's a little example of trying to understand that. This is some simple model experiments. So a hydrological model, so it's taking precipitation and other things as inputs, and it's giving you runoff. So potentially some estimation of flooding. So if you start to aggregate those inputs, those precipitation inputs, okay, so instead of giving it hourly, you give it 3 hourly or 6 hourly, daily or even longer, how does that affect the runoff? Well, so it doesn't matter too much when you are thinking about aggregating the model at 3 hourly or 6 hourly, but as you get a bit coarser in that aggregation, you start to lose some of those extremes. So the things you're really interested in, the flooding, starts to disappear, so you're underestimating those kind of extreme events. The mean of the distribution here doesn't matter too much, starts to go a little bit awry as you get to aggregating to numbers of days, but you necessarily wouldn't really do that anyway. In terms of daily total runoff, so just interested in, say, not the flooding itself, but how much water is actually coming out of the system, it doesn't matter too much about what scale of aggregation you're doing, and this is kind of important in terms of what kind of data do you have as well? Do you have sub-daily precipitation data? Do you have daily precipitation data? Often it's the daily precipitation data that's measured and is available, but you're actually missing quite a lot of the picture here if you're using that kind of data. Another aspect is food security. So thinking about the kind of complex scale interactions that impinge on, say, a smallholder farmer who lives in quite a complex landscape like this. So the outcomes, the food security outcomes, are really a combination of not just how much rainfall there is, how much water there is, but it's a whole bunch of things. It's a whole bunch of things about flood hazards, drought hazards, how the river basin is managed around that farmer, In times of need, are there food transfers? Is there domestic trade? Is there a national food policy that impinges on the farmer, making the farmer buy certain types of seeds or use certain types of fertilizers as well? And then when you think about the larger scale, so food aid, international trade, can all affect what happens at this very local scale. So you have to think not just about how much food can the farmer produce and how, but also what's happening at all these other scales as well. So of course modeling comes into this. This is just another example trying to think about some of those kind of metrics of food security or things that would allow a farmer to do things better. So when you're thinking about growing crops, especially in kind of dryland areas, how much water is available? Is there enough rainfall? And if there isn't, what is that kind of crop water deficit? Okay, oops, not doing too well with this pointer. So if you have an understanding of how much, what is the lack of water, given that you're in a fairly dry region for the crops you want to grow, is there potential to irrigate? Okay, so you can get that from surface water, you can probably get that from shallow groundwater. So what we did here is a little bit of a modeling experiment where you try to estimate these two things, okay? So the goal in the end was to try to say, can you actually irrigate and improve food security? But doing this at two different kind of scales, okay? So running the model at 2 kilometers or 4 kilometers, so a very simple experiment, you actually end up with quite different answers in terms of how much the crops need or what you're lacking, and then how much is the irrigation potential. So I haven't really analyzed why this is, but it's a complex landscape when you think about, well, if you're taking water from here, then some of it's not actually making it downstream as well. So there's these kind of spatial connections as well as just the fundamental changes in the values as you scale up and down as well. Okay, so thinking about models, so I do a lot of modeling work, and of course, you know, models are pretty crap most of the time, but they're actually quite useful some of the time and in some places as well. So trying to think about where we use models. So generally, we use hydrological models, well, across all scales. We would actually like to use them for decision making across this kind of blue area here. So thinking about, say, mitigating climate change impacts or adaptation to climate change impacts, right down to doing stuff about what's happening in the upcoming season. Do we manage our reservoir in a different way? Do we plant different crops? Right down to the kind of small scale where we're thinking about urban flood risk, or we're thinking about kind of week-to-week decisions about farming as well. Do we irrigate? Do we weed? And so on. Now, of course, if we think about the models that we have, their kind of skill is basically up here in terms of, say, forecasting. How good is the skill to actually forecast into the future? And how good are they at actually representing the observations that we do have? So there's a bit of a gap here. So we would actually like to bring everything down to here. So there's real challenges in doing that in terms of our understanding of the scales of the processes, the physics, but also the data that goes into these models to drive them, but also to test them as well, to evaluate these models as well. Okay, so that's taken me about 15 slides to actually get to the challenges slide, but here they are, and some opportunities as well, I think. So, so scaling, transfer of information from one scale to another. So potential benefits of thinking about this or doing this in a better way, and I guess this cuts across some of the other topics that people are talking about, but especially for the things that I work on. So understanding fundamental behavior. So we would really, at almost a theoretical level, try to understand what the processes are, how they scale, and so on, how they interact. So identifying those key processes and interactions, we would like those to improve the structure and parameterization of models. We would like our models to be better, and understanding that scaling behavior is pretty important. As mentioned by previous speaker, upscaling and downscaling, of course, is really important. We like to upscale to the decision making level. We would also like to downscale to understand what is happening at the field scale. We may not be able to measure, but we would like to use models to look at that as well. And of course, this all links to the decision making scale, which could be local, it could be district or higher as well. So what are the challenges? So we like to answer a few questions. How do interactions among multiple processes across scales affect hydrological behavior at other scales? Okay, so a fundamental cross-cutting question, I think. How do we transfer information from the process or the observable scale, so there's an observational aspect to this as well, to the model or the decision-making scale? And the model could be limited by computational power, for example. So some key challenges here. Processes and their interactions are scale dependent. So the example with the surface water, groundwater is a good example of how important these interactions are, not just across scales, but they happen at some point scales, but don't happen over the larger scale. The lack of data to characterize processes or interactions, and that data to parameterize, test, and improve models, as I said before. So generally in hydrology, you take your model, you take some streamflow data, you calibrate it, you say, check, it's all done, fantastic. But you can get multiple parameters that give you the same kind of answer. You have no idea what's happening within the catchment. So very good for actually predicting streamflow, but not very good for anything else. So we have to move away from that kind of idea of this kind of lumped calibration, lumped evaluation, to think more spatially and more temporally about how we improve and test our models. And of course, incorporating human interactions and how these play out across scales is really important as well. So a lot of work has been done to incorporate human management into models, and I think maybe Simon, you probably talked about this a little bit yesterday, talking about hydrojoules. But there are lots of issues there in terms of how do we actually parameterize, what do we actually have data to characterize the human interactions and so on, especially as they change so rapidly over time. So a bunch of opportunities, I'll talk about a few of those. So regionalization or scaling approaches that basically to try to bring observations and the models closer together. New multi-scale observations, including a lot of non-traditional ones as well. So I'll give a few examples. It's not just about going into the field and measuring hydrological variables. It's not just about satellite remote sensing, and there are many, many other opportunities to use non-traditional data as well. Remote sensing is still important and getting even more important, but also UAVs at the kind of local scale. So put up your little drone, you can get centimeter scale information that is really useful for characterizing the problem, but also testing your models, especially in a spatial sense. And better models as well. So models are improving, we have high performance computing, so we can actually run at finer resolutions if we believe that we can actually represent the processes. So getting down to resolving those kind of processes with the models, and also multi-scale assimilation, which I won't really talk about, but trying to think about how you directly bring models and data together, but across scales, because we have information at the very fine resolution, but we also have information at coarse resolution. So how do we actually bring those two things together? So a few examples of some of those kind of opportunities, but also maybe some challenges. So similarity, the idea of similarity can help a bit, I think. This is a paper from a few years ago where they were looking at streamflow across the United States and thinking, well, are there certain characteristics of the landscape or the climate that give us similar kind of behavior in the streamflow that we see from the observations? So they took some simple metrics, aridity metric, a seasonality metric for precipitation, and then something about snow, okay? So maybe three clear things that drive variability across these large scales. If you then cluster those, you end up with some different types of catchment in terms of the streamflow. So snow dominated, precipitation in phase with the streamflow, precipitation out of phase, mild seasonality and humid. So these are quite clear kind of clusters. So if you actually look at the streamflow from those different clusters, it's a bit fuzzy, but hopefully you can see it. It's actually not bad at actually characterizing the streamflow, so there's not too much variability within those classes. So okay, it does a nice prediction of seasonality of streamflow. But when you actually look at things like floods, which may be a much more interesting thing to look at, beyond just the standard kind of how much water do we have and how does it vary over the season, then you see much more variability. There's much more noise that's driving this kind of variability that's really not captured in these kind of simple similarity metrics. Parameter scaling has been around for a long time, trying to think about, well, how do you have effective parameters at a larger scale in your models, okay? Are there ways of actually doing that in a better way? This is a pretty oldish paper, 10 years old now, but just doing calibration to actually go across scales. So what are the parameters that you would need to give you the same answer if you are modeling at different time or space scales? Now you can do that by brute force, but it's not very transferable. Those parameters could be just one-off combinations, so we don't really know if this is transferable, and it's very difficult to interpret as well. There may be better ways of doing this, where you're going down to the scale of your kind of data, your soils, your land cover, your climate data, and using, instead of calibrating the model, you're actually calibrating the upscaling functions, the functions that go from your input fields of land use and soils to your model parameters. So using these kind of super parameters to actually scale those functions. And these kind of papers here are showing some promise in doing a better job of parameterizing models across scales and making them a bit more consistent, having some scaling to this. So lots of new opportunities with data as well. Lots of new missions, satellite products are coming out. This is just a few examples of some of those that are relevant for land surface processes, for hydrology. So you can basically measure just about every part of the hydrological cycle, even groundwater at large scales from satellites now. So there is lots of promise in using those and combining those together with models to actually give us better predictions, better simulations. There's also a lot of scope for using the commercial side of things as well. So we tend not to pay for things in academia. We don't have enough money. But there are lots of ways of working with these commercial companies, and they're actually putting up really interesting satellites, and I say satellites with an S because putting up these clusters of satellites, CubeSats essentially, that are not quite giving you the full spectral bands that you might get from one of these agency satellites, but they are giving you much finer resolution. They're giving you more repeat time, so you're actually getting this daily rather than, say, every 8 days or whatever. And you can see here how this is going from Landsat, which a lot of us have used for a very long time, to more recent Sentinel satellites, and now down to these kind of commercial flocks of satellites, where you're getting down to the plant scale. So you're actually resolving what's happening within, say, this irrigation field. So this is really exciting for understanding right down to the process level of the plant. And as I said, there's a lot of kind of non-traditional sources of information that are available and we should be using as well. So crowdsourcing, so people on their phones saying this is how deep the water is, this is what's happening. Also with social media, I'm in a flood. You don't really get much more information than that, but once you cluster all that non-traditional, qualitative, unstructured information together, you might be able to use it in some way. Alternative sensor networks. So this is just an example here of the attenuation of a microwave signal between cell towers. That can actually give you some sense of what the precipitation is, and there's some operational products that are using that. And of course UAVs, low-cost sensors as well. So often you put up a meteorological station, it costs you $10,000. It's a lot of money, and you can't put those in many places. But you can do this with lower accuracy at a fraction of the cost, and probably lower than $200 now. So these lots of information, unstructured, structured, traditional, non-traditional, that we can use to help understand processes, improve our models as well. And there's been a steady evolution in modeling as well. So for a number of reasons, and there's good reason to really think about combining data and models together, all these new sources of data, with our evolving models as well. This here is this is what I was doing in 2003, so I thought I was pretty good producing black and white figures of a global hydrological model simulation at 2-degree resolution. So that's about 200 kilometers by 200 kilometers. So state of the art back then. I thought it was all pretty fancy. But now we're now modeling at kind of the 30-meter resolution continentally, okay? So a 10,000 or whatever it is fold increase in the resolution that's now allowing us to resolve the field scale at the continental domain. So very exciting, and this is really because of high-performance computing that's allowing us to not only model at these kind of resolutions and scales, but also to do this multiple times to estimate the uncertainties as well. So one final example is a particular model that we've been using to produce these kind of simulations of soil moisture. So this is Hydroblocks, which essentially kind of clusters the landscape. So you're thinking about what different types of landscape do I have across the catchment, across the whole domain. Put those together, so does it have similar soils, slope, topography and so on, similar kind of land cover, and you can actually chop up a complex landscape into a much smaller set of representative units, or hydrological response units, HRUs as they're called here. So this is just an example of how that clustering works. So you get all your inputs, you cluster it, and you end up, here as an example, with 3 HRUs of how you would cluster that. And then you're running the model just on those different clusters. And of course there's a trade-off between how you represent the variability and basically your computational needs as well. So there's something in between that gives you the same answer as a fully explicit model, and being able to do this in a decent enough time as well. So this is, I'm going to show a video, hopefully it's going to work, just showing the output of this model across the US for 1 year. This is surface soil moisture, so it's the top kind of 10 centimeters of soil moisture, and you'll see some of the kind of seasonal dynamics, but also the kind of diurnal, so within day, but also the kind of storm dynamics as well. So hopefully I can get this working. How much time do I have? Negative 5 minutes?
Negative 5 minutes.
Okay. It's working here but not there. Can I reset it to the beginning? Maybe it will loop anyway. Okay, so this is, as I said, surface soil moisture. It's a 3-hourly time step, so it's going pretty fast, but you can actually see the kind of diurnal cycle. So this is January, end of January. The top blue part up the top there is a little bit wetter. That's essentially where you still have snow, frozen soils, okay? But you actually see a bit of diurnal melting and freezing as well. Probably missed it by now. You can also see, of course, you can see the diversity across the whole continent that's really driven by topography, where the rivers are, where the mountains are. You can start to see the storms going across, of course. So this is not precipitation, this is the soil moisture response. So as the storms come across the country, you can see that footprint, and often you can see it wet up and then dry down within the day or even a few days later. So now we're in May. You start to see the southwest really drying down here, so getting very brown. You start to see now in the southeast, down in Florida, you're starting to see convective storms. So you see those pulsing, and you see the footprint of that in the soil moisture. Actually, the Florida is actually drying down too quickly. There's a problem with the parameters for this particular model. Again, now you're coming into the late summer, so now you really see the pulsing of the convective storms down in the southeast and also across the southwest. Very dry, but this is the North American monsoon coming in, bringing precipitation into that area. You see the Mississippi Basin wetting up. Now we're coming into August, and we should see, okay, we're still seeing some of those convective storms. They should start to disappear now. We're now in hurricane season. I don't know if we can see one, but you might be able to see a tropical cyclone come through if you keep your eyes open. I'd like to say there's one, and you missed it. There's one. There we go. I knew there was one somewhere. Okay, now we're going into the cooler season, so you'll start to see the soil moisture becoming somewhat stable in the north and in the Rocky Mountains over to the west there, into November. And coming into December, you see things starting to settle down a bit more and getting these frontal storms coming across again. So this is a model that we can run basically a 30-meter resolution with not too much computational effort, so a standard kind of university cluster. And there you go, you can see the cooling down and the freezing up of the soil moisture. So very useful, not just for doing large-scale domains like this, but really getting down to the field scale and combining that with satellite remote sensing, other kinds of information to really get at what's happening in developing regions where we really don't have any on-the-ground information, really to understand the variability in things like soil moisture, runoff production, potential for flooding, and things like food security as well. So, okay, sorry for going over. I'm going to try to get back to the last slide. Okay, challenged by a Windows machine. All right, went back to the beginning. I wonder if I can remember my conclusions. I'm not sure. One back. That's it. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so you can kind of read those for yourselves. We do know something about the scale of processes, hydrological processes, and the scales that they interact at, and something about the emergent behavior, how these scale up. But we don't really know this fully, so there's no kind of unified theory that you might have in other kind of disciplines. So some hydrologists think about this in a lot of their work. I don't tend to think about this, but the general feeling is that we don't really know enough to say something right across scales and domains. We can observe some processes at the characteristic scale and capture the variability, but there's a new diversity of new data, not just satellites and traditional observational systems, but lots of other data sources that we should be harnessing. Models are getting better computationally, structurally, and the models and data are really kind of bridging across the scales to get down to almost the field scale, which is very useful. And ultimately, with everything, there are scale implications for decision making. Okay, so thanks.
Take any questions now. We'll go for coffee. We have a moderated panel discussion after coffee for about half an hour. So that's we'll restart shortly past 11, and let's say 5 past 11. People will give a bit of extra time. Thank you very much to both speakers.